Start again.
Well, good afternoon everyone, and welcome yet again to an afternoon session at the European School. And I thought it would be useful to link in with our last speaker, Professor Jocelyn Godwin, when he warned us of the dangers of what I would call blind servility to any one teaching or any one authority. And really, as far as I'm concerned, there is no problem with the Mahatma's letter KH that 2/3 of the world's evil is caused by religion. Of course, religion with a small r. And perhaps he was alluding to Krishnamurti's message about making God in the image of man. Of course, we can think of Richard Dawkins. I'm sure HBB would refer to Professor Dawkins. I would like to think that she would call him one of, I quote, the intellectual and moral murderers of our society in his book The God Delusion. But what Dawkins does, he throws out the baby with the bathwater, whereas HBB, KH and Krishnamurti provide an alternative bath for the baby to be in. There is no problem in my mind with religion, and Krishnamurti never denied God, nor did KH. In their famous dialogue with David Bohm, they agreed that God is a metaphor for universal intelligence, and that exists, but what man does is he makes God in his image, and that's where the problem lies, and it's as simple as that. So no one denies God, but we deny that horrible, what Blavatsky would call churchianity rather than Christianity. Speaking personally, without God, life would be meaningless, it would be an utter hypocrisy, and it would be empty and ugly without that nameless higher power in whom we live and move. And there is, for me, no better dedication to God than Paul Brunton's book, where he says that this book is made dedicate to that sage of the Orient, Ramana Maharshi, at whose behest these pages were written. And he ends by saying, if the dealings of the cards of destiny bid me wear cloth of another hue, command me to mix and mingle with the world, and help to carry on its work, be assured that somewhere in the deep recesses of my heart I have gathered all my desires into a little heap and offered them to the nameless higher power. The lovely word for God. And if 2/3 of the world's evils are caused by religion, with a small r, we must make sure that we do not turn theosophy into a little religion with a small r. We want theosophy, not theosophization, the churchianity equivalent. Alright? So now we will talk about the fact that the inner knowing flushes out the outer ignorance, and when that happens, then all the problems and all the pain starts. So here is a bowl of water. And if I poke my finger into it, nothing happens, does it? But now if I take a larger object and plunge it in, what happens? The water gets displaced out into the surroundings. And this is nothing other than Archimedes' principle, of course, that a solid object immersed in a liquid displaces some of the liquid taken up by the space. When the volume is barely noticeable, my little finger, the displacement is very small. When the volume is large, like that jug of water, that glass of water, then the displacement is much larger. That's what Archimedes discovered, so we are told. And I don't suggest that we divest ourselves of our clothing and run out naked out of our showers when they work, shouting Eureka into the streets of Venice. But I suggest we draw on this principle of Archimedes and see really what he's getting at. So the contents today are as follows. This is a little small, but I will call it out, and I do have handouts. So the inner knowing flushes out the outer ignorance, and this is what causes all the pain. And Archimedes' principle, then some occult physics with a heavy warning by Blavatsky, then revisiting the ego. What is it? The ego illuminated. What happens when the ego is illuminated? Cultivating tidiness of the lower mind. And how do we deal with temptation? Some more occult physics. And then what happens when the shadow of death becomes our tutor? So let's start with this strange warning by H.P. Blavatsky, which cannot be repeated, assimilated, digested and taken note of too strongly. That, and I'll call it out. There is this strange law in occult physics which has been proven ever since the Theosophic Society was formed and before. And its action is the more acute, the more earnest the aspiration and sincerity of the disciple, of the chela. And what it says is, as soon as anyone pledges oneself to studying, practicing the occult path, there is a throwing outwards of all latent inner tendencies. So whereas in normal life a person could, say, hide his truly selfish nature by buying champagne at a dinner party, at a certain stage he will no longer be able to repress his true nature, which will be thrown up to the surface, and he will have to deal with it. That, in sort of simple language, is what HPB's imperious warning is all about. So she says, if a man be vain or sensual, he will not be able to hide it under the mask of civilization. Equally, all our good qualities, hitherto latent, will be intensified and brought out to the surface. So this is why I call it spiritual Archimedes principle, because the awakening to the occult truths is like displacing all the inner ignorance by a powerful force that pushes out everything out to the surface and makes one very aware of it. So the old saying, man know thyself, cannot be taken too seriously. And this is an immutable law in the domain of the occult. If you really think of it, it's not at all surprising. If I absolutely swear, this has never happened to me, allegiance to my wife, be terribly faithful to you, I'm going to meet the pretty girl opposite me in the office to tempt my resolve. The stronger the resolve, the greater the temptation. One finds this in normal life. But the action is much more serious in the domain of the occult. And I have observed that the two characteristics that get thrown out by this awakening are unresolved power complexes. And the Theosophical Society is not immune from that. And at the more personal level, well, we can think of unrequited love, being jilted, sexual hang-ups, all of that get intensified and thrown up. We can think of the situation of Richard Hodgson, who wrote the Hodgson report. Did you know that he lived in Australia, Hodgson, and he was jilted by a girl there, and then sailed to England, and then studied at Cambridge. And then he met HPB there, and HPB refused to demonstrate her occult powers to him. So you have this person with angst in his psyche, jilted in Australia. He is again, not jilted, but again there is angst stirred up because HPB does not fulfill his wishes. So what better thing to do than to blow out his angst by writing an infamous report criticizing HPB. I'm putting it very simplistically, but I'm making the point that whatever we do is really a reflection of our inner state. And in Hodgson's case, I suggest, and this is only my opinion, that it was the angst in his psyche that also contributed to his infamous report. Because then, what better to do than to defame a famous person? We all know this. If we are irritated, then little irritations that happened to us yesterday or the day before loom large. When we are irritated in a traffic jam, we get very angry with someone who we were not angry with 10 minutes ago. Does that not happen? So this is why the spiritual and the occult path brings difficulties. Not that occultism per se, in its own, brings difficulties, but for the necessary inner growth and mastery of self, all these weaknesses have got to be ironed out by being thrown up and tested. So let sleeping dogs lie, or in Gujarati, sutera sampne na utar, do not wake up a sleeping snake, are well-known utterances in the domain of the occult. And as I say, they warn of this strange law which has always been proven, and no man or woman really knows his moral strength until it is tried and tested. Because then there occurs the throwing out of all latent qualities, and the varnish of civilization and good breeding will no longer be able to repress all these latent tendencies. Now, this throwing out of latent tendencies applies not only to individuals, but also to groups and societies. A pitiful case of a powerful floodlight flushing out and so attracting a whole load of nasties and beasties, illuminating, in other words, malevolent entities, is the case in 1968 of the assassination of Robert Kennedy. And it was broadcast all over NBC that Sirhan Sirhan, the assassin, had asked his jailer for a copy of Madame Blavatsky's Secret Doctrine. To this absolutely true statement was added this further statement that Blavatsky had formed a society for the bringing about of anarchy by the murder of well-known individuals in society. And this was broadcast by Truman Capote of NBC all over America. And protests to the contrary were completely ignored. Right? The story was summarized in Time, weekly news magazine, all over the world. But suppose Sirhan Sirhan asked for a copy of Einstein's General and Special Relativity. I've read that book. Would Einstein have been labelled a mass murderer on the grounds that, I have it, he wrote President Roosevelt a letter recommending that a boat full of atomic warfare driven into the port could be used to blow up the port? This was before the Manhattan Project developed the bomb. So would Einstein be recommended mass murderer? I don't think so. And Einstein, incidentally, we're told, possessed a copy of The Secret Doctrine and gave it to Robert Millikan. So, this speaks volumes about human nature, doesn't it? As Sri Aurobindo says, reminded by Paul Brunton, that those who work for the survival of truth in a truthless world will always become the targets for powerful evil forces of wrath and falsehood. And whoever bears a deeply spiritual message to humanity has to suffer for evil's opposition. And there are plenty of warped minds fumbling on the subhuman level of existence who will spit poison and spill hatred on those who declare the existence of higher realms. And I've given you just one true incident. So now we can appreciate the Mahatma's statement that, pushed by malevolent hands, the society needs every man and woman strong in the cause of truth. But alas, that some of those malevolent hands have and can exist, like a Trojan horse, within the society itself. Even more can we see that secret doctrine and occultism is indeed for the few, because it can only cause turmoil in the psyche that has not acquired stability, balance, and intellectual faculty. Why intellectual when we are all supposed to dispense with the lower mind? We're not supposed to dispense with the lower mind. It's far too naive. Lower mind provides the necessary checks and tests to distinguish between our wild fantasies and our genuine vision. Intellect never tells us the truth, but it helps to tell us what truth is not. It acts like a corrosive acid that strips away the surface layers of superstition and nonsense. Now, I told you about that strange law in occultism, so forcefully enumerated by Blavatsky. But why does it happen? And this is where I come to the balance between theory and practice. I talked yesterday about the tremendous precepts, the doctrines, but the implementation, why does it happen? But there we have to look further, and no greater one than Paul Brunton, when he says that deep down in the lowest strata of the subconscious nature, there lurks negative tendencies and evil memories belonging to the far, perhaps even pre-human past, that are not wholly wiped out by the spiritual rebirth, and confront us at crucial moments in our lives, when we seek illumination into and by the higher self, or by a master, which is really the same thing. We seek a master, we're seeking the higher self. And in their totality, these tendencies are named the dweller on the threshold, the dweller on the threshold. And no man can be taken possession of by his higher self and enter into a permanent relationship with a master until he develops sufficient calm and strength to displace out, this is my little phrase, to displace out by Archimedes' principle, meaning to overcome these risen tendencies whose characteristic is marked by a single or combination of extreme brutality, sensuality, and in my opinion, extreme cunning. The cunning, not of the animal, it's an insult to the animal, the cunning of the monster, which has nothing to do with intelligence. That cunning to twist everything to one's own power-seeking purposes. So now you can appreciate this remark of Blavatsky's, and again, if you stick just to Blavatsky, you would not have got this, I put to you. But Brunton has extracted this letter from Blavatsky to Judge. And I ask you, a lot of people want to meet a master, Don't ask to meet a master. I really tell you, beware. At one of our last Theoversity weekends, you remember an Indian gentleman, he came up to me and said, where in England can I find a master? So I said, A, I don't know, and B, I suggest you don't look for one, for this reason. Blavatsky to Judge, as given to us by Brunton. You force yourself into a master's presence and you take on the consequences of the immense forces playing around the master, and if you are weak, the black ones will open up any chink in your armour, so to speak, and infiltrate you and wreak havoc. And if you are not strong enough, you may become a wreck for that life. This is one reason why masters do not appear and do not act directly very often, and so need to work through an intermediary. So be careful before you want to meet a master. Life can be extremely painful. And of course the master is not a glamour image of a person or KH or whatever. Your master could be a highly advanced friend, or a very deep occult book, or any experience of that nature. So it is vital to appreciate that to look human is not necessarily to be human. They are human emissaries of the adverse element in nature that will seek to open up and prise open any crack in the psyche. And this applies equally to groups, which is why Blavatsky has warned us, committees, please note, that any disharmony in a meeting dedicated to occult inquiry, any disharmony is used by these malevolent entities to serve their own ends and to seek to wreak havoc. And I'm not trying to sound pessimistic or melodramatic, but I'm really trying to tell you what's actually happening. And you know, if one can't face what actually happens, then one's not a truth seeker. You know, life isn't just a bowl of cherries. It is a bowl of cherries, but there are other things as well. The rose has thorns. So now, what is the ego? I'm certainly not going to go into that huge subject and put up all the principles. But just for now, let's look at the ego like this. And you can always, in all of life, you can see esoteric pointers, because everything in life reflects the one law. So here's the ego. Personality, individuality. This is the mask, right? But do you note that even the mask has a window? So our personality does not completely cover our individuality. There is always a window open into our inner self. So even this humble little mask can reveal something of occult truths. So the ego, for me, is that, or the ego misused, is that energy entity that lives by a false light and draws its energy from its parent source without acknowledging the source, and indeed believes itself, fools itself, that it is that source. It is, if you like, the shadow that life and light cast upon its own path. But now, what happens when the ego is illuminated? Meaning, what happens when a person begins to make contact with the higher self, joins the Theosophical Society, say, and makes some genuine effort on the path of spiritual unfoldment? What happens? what happens is the inner light burns brighter, hotter and stronger, and in so doing the outer layers of the ego are thinned down and worn down. You may say, well, that's great, but let me say why it's not so great and why there is a warning here. Let us say the outer layers of the ego are represented by these colours, red, orange, yellow. So normally, of course, the ego, the personality, is it not illuminated by the higher self? So it's illuminated by the higher self. But that's not much of a bright light, is it? It's just well, it's a bit of an illumination. But what happens when an individual takes an interest in the occult truths and the light burns much brighter and hotter? So then what happens is this. When that light burns bright and hot, the structure, the layers of the ego get rather powerfully illuminated by the light. And can you see that this light is much stronger than the other light? And when that happens, yeah, can you see that? The ego starts to get worn down and thinned down, and then instead of being all opaque, the ego becomes powerfully illuminated, like that. More light can get through, can't it? But in letting more light through, the ego qualities are accentuated. So, if this be insane lust for power, it'll be accentuated. If this be real, genuine desire to help humanity, it'll be accentuated. If this be intellectual selfishness, it'll be accentuated. So, what we have to do is we don't destroy our ego, we use the ego. So we make the ego clean. You make the ego like this, or even better, you make the ego like this. So it acts really as the servant of the higher self and doesn't introduce any colouring and pollution of its own. So this is why when people join the society or spiritual societies, you know, we can say, well, how can you act so selfishly when you join the Theosophical Society? Well, this is exactly the reason. Because in your effort to advance on the path, whatever your weakness is has been exaggerated. So now a bit more on this whole question of the higher and the lower self. And I've called it the barometer of the soul. The whole man during earthly life. We know these principles, the individuality, the personality. It can be viewed, it can be stratified into spirit, soul and body, and we have all these various divisions. We're not concerned about that at the moment. What we are concerned about is this, that crucial passage in the Key where Blavatsky talks about Plato and says Plato warns us that the soul, in the generic sense, has a choice. It can either ascend to nous, that's the barometer going upwards, the mind principle of course, or the soul can descend towards anoia. Now, exactly like buoyancy, if you push a heavy stone into water, it sinks, doesn't it? If you put a cork into water, it rises. So you have a spiritual Archimedes principle at work there. We have a choice. We can rise to nous, which is really the buddhi, or we can descend to anoia. And anoia really means folly, or the irrational self. And of course this is not the only way of putting it. And if you recall, there is this steep and narrow, thorny passage from the pit of the Great Pyramid to the King's Chamber, which is one way of looking at that symbolism, is that there is a path from Anoia to nous, but it's a very dusty, steep and thorny path, but still it does exist. And it is a path that an advanced soul, by a tremendous exertion of will, can journey up. And I'll give you one example from the music of Schubert, but not to be taken too literally, of course. So, No. Sorry, Colin. Thank you. But thanks for listening so attentively. No, you may relax. So let's just get back to Karma Manas. Very important. How do we cultivate the Manas aspect in order to keep karma in check? In other words, use karma, the desire principle, as a propelling force instead of being overwhelmed by it like a tsunami. You can't go anywhere without propulsion, and you won't go anywhere without a steering and navigation system. You need the propelling force of karma. So we have to cultivate tidiness of mind, and this is all in my handout, so don't get too hung up about not reading it. Right, so if I just summarize all that, to cultivate tidiness of mind, the first thing we do is we don't repeat ourselves. Because every repetition, especially in a committee, is a degradation of thought. A degradation of the power of the original essence, and so an increase in entropy. So we need to think how to say the minimum to the maximum effect. Why has the good Lord, God, that nameless higher power, whatever you like, why has he, she, it, given us one mouth, 2 ears? I think there's a good reason for it, to be used in that proportion. Then I see people at meetings putting up their hands for 10 minutes. It's pretty obvious if your hand's up for 10 minutes, you haven't heard anything that's being said because you're just waiting to jump in. I'm talking about cultivating tidiness of mind. Then we need to discriminate cause from consequence, consequence from necessary conditions. The seed is the cause of the fruit. The earth is the necessary condition, and the consequence is the fruit. In the human being, the coming together of the sperm and the egg is the cause. The amniotic fluid provides the conditions, and the consequence is the baby. These all have got to be distinguished at their own level. And we tend to confuse causes with conditions. And it is so easy to fall in the trap of emotionalisms like, oh, he's useless, or he doesn't know a thing. That says nothing. We are taught at school and university, don't say it, demonstrate it. Instead of saying he's useless, just say what he's useless at, and leave people to conclude that he's useless, rather than being, and we spoke about being judgmental, Ingrid, that is being judgmental. Don't say he can't add up, just show the fact that his arithmetic shows that 2 and 2 equals 10. Now, I think it is so important to organize one's thinking hierarchically, that's the vertical dimension of thought, but also in a networking fashion, that's the horizontal dimension of thought. and always to see the larger picture. Of course, when we buy food, it costs money, but you don't say, I'm not going to waste money and buy food, because the food provides, the expenditure of money provides the bigger picture. It provides the sustenance for the body. So of course the car costs petrol, but you wouldn't get to your theosophical meeting without spending money on petrol. But if we look at things in a narrow way, it's very easy to say this costs money, let's not do it. By looking at the wider picture, we see, we gain a deeper perspective and a true understanding of where our energies and our money can be placed. And most of all, realize that a half-truth is the twin brother of a lie because of what is concealed. If I said HPB was shown to be an impostor and a charlatan, it is true. It is true. But if I then add, by Richard Hodgson, whose scurrilous report was squashed by Vernon Harrison, then I'm providing the true truth, the real truth. What Einstein always said, the distinction between the relative truth, which is all science could find, and the real truth, which, as Einstein said, was only the province of the universal observer. Now that's another word for God, the universal observer. That's the scientist's word. In mathematical terms, the universal observer is the integration from 0 to 360 of d observation d theta. Is that right? Something like that. Yeah. So let's again deal with this intellect problem. And we must cultivate the lower mind, because the truth is not opposed to intellect, but it is beyond intellect. And the truth is not against knowledge, but it is above knowledge. So if we look at this little graph, the extremity of the intellect and the extremity of the knowledge provides the frontier of the lower mind. But truth is not against it, it is beyond it in both dimensions. So and this especially applies to those who try and glean higher truths from the basis of physical science only and limit the discovery of truth just to the intellectual inquiry. So now how do we deal with temptation? We've talked about bolstering up the manas component of kama manas in order to use intellect as a corrosive acid to strip out superstition. How do we avoid then the temptation of kama? Kama, as I said, desire, is vital. It's only excessive temptation that leads to anoia, the plunge into the irrational soul. Because this action of the flushing out and throwing out of all dark cobwebs in our psyche into the light appears to me to be none other than an accentuation of temptation in a big way. Temptation appears in a dozen guises: gluttony, alcoholism, power, sexual appetite, all of which are connected, they're not disconnected. Another negative tendency is false humility. You know, pretending to be so terribly humble when you know damn well you're not. You know, everyone should really walk his true height. There's no point in trying to pretend that you're 1,000 feet tall in spiritual understanding when you're not, and there's no point in trying to pretend you're only 1 inch high when you are your true height. So how should we deal with temptation? Well, in our quieter moments, to strengthen our inner resolve in order to provide that support and direction to which we must move on our chosen path. So a little bit of more of occult physics. We all knew at school that there is a difference between shall I hold this? Between stable equilibrium and unstable equilibrium. And you're smiling because you've seen this before, Colin. So if you have a bowl like that, not a bowl of water, an empty bowl, and you have a ball at the bottom, and if I move this ball up to the side, what happens? It rolls down. Obviously, it comes back there. Why? Because there is a force towards the centre, there is a force towards the centre that acts whenever that ball is displaced. And you can move it up this side, you can move it up this side. I mean, there's the force of gravity there, there is the resistance there, but never mind all that Newtonian physics. There is a force that moves it down, that's pretty obvious. But now what happens if you have the ball reversed, like that, and you have the ball on top? What happens if I now displace it even a little bit? It rolls off, doesn't it? And it never gets back. So that's unstable equilibrium. So what's the message? Very simply, that the more we cultivate our inner resolve, the more we are taken back to centre whenever we are thrown off course. If you think of a good driver, if you really learn to drive well, then when you have an off day, you are still brought back to centre because of your training and your learning. If you are a rash driver, then the slightest disturbance and you might have an accident. Any technique well learned will bring you back to centre. If you can only just play a Beethoven sonata, on a bad day you'll make a mess of it. If you've learned that sonata thoroughly on a bad day, that the force of your learning will bring you back to centre. So by cultivating one's resolve in quieter moments, by understanding the true spiritual teachings, one is able thereby to deal with temptation. Does that make sense? Good. So just a little warning as far as I'm concerned. In looking at ourselves, it is not advisable to try and benchmark or to gauge our spiritual progress on the path. And the great sages have advised us that it is no easy matter to evaluate our spiritual progress. So, for example, keeping calm at 3 a.m. at Collins bus stop in the rain, or in the stifling heat at Bombay airport, may be much more of an indication of spiritual progress than giving a very erudite lecture on the 7 principles of man. It is not an easy matter to gauge one's own spiritual advancement, and it is not at all helpful either. What happens then when the shadow of death becomes our tutor? Meaning, how will an advanced soul deepen and enrich its contact with nous? Because I want to really end this lecture with this whole question of the path of return. And this word, the shadow of death, becomes our tutor, is not mine. It is something that is pretty well known. People in their last years regret not having done what they should have done. For example, there was a very rich and powerful lawyer who failed to achieve the ambition he sought. And then he had a heart attack. And while he was recuperating, he then said, my life has just been a toing and froing, from being knocked from pillar to post, in a useless turmoil and a chase over money and ambition. And then, as Bronten tells us, he died a year later, not a happy man, having only just learned what the shadow of death had taught him as its tutor. So, In the final few months of his own life, Schubert, aged 31, aware that some of his excesses of annoia had accelerated his premature death, Schubert was able to make virtually unbroken contact with nous, from which august level streamed forth a whole proliferation of compositions and a level of inspiration that Benjamin Britten himself said was quite unsurpassed in all of musical history, except that I would add in the last 11 months of Mozart's own life, at the age of 35. And in the last few months of Schubert's life, when he only had one concert of his own music, and even that concert was eclipsed by Paganini in Vienna, then a black-winged demon of sorrow overshadowed his last days, and nous was quickened by annoia in Schubert's case, and it produced a whole unbroken stream of compositions like the last three piano sonatas, the Mass in E-flat, the great C major quintet, of course, the Fantasy in C for violin and piano, the C major symphony, Sir Adrian Bolt's favourite, sketches for a 10th symphony, the song collection Schwanengesang, and of course the most incredible work, the Winterreise. So if we put this in terms of the 7 principles, we have the painful return from annoia to nous. And in the words of a Viennese court official, and I'm only quoting him, I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but in the words of a Viennese court official, he said Schubert's strong body was succumbed to the cleavage in his soul, of which one part pressed heavenwards and the other part was bathed in slime. Now that's a ghastly term, phrase to use for a composer we absolutely love and adore. And I'm not saying I agree with this or I disagree, but there is absolutely no evidence, no doubt about it, that Schubert certainly did indulge tremendously, and he was taken astray by his friend Franz Schauber in the brothels, and he made contact with the Viennese prostitutes, and thereby contacted syphilis. But the point I'm trying to make is this, that the heavenwards return from annoia to nous. There is a lovely saying, isn't there not, in the Bible, that the light of the body is in the eye. If therefore thine eye be single, thy body will be full of light. And Hüttenbrenner, Schubert's colleague, friend, said that Schubert's eyes literally shone with light when he was composing. His eyes shone with light. And Brunton just expands this light in the eye with this little explanation that when the spiritual light of the body enters through the eye, if therefore the eye be turned away from the complicated multiplicity and the mind be turned and withdrawn into its own nature, then the whole body will be permeated by the spiritual light, and it will then radiate outwards. So the downward slide towards annoia, in other words, sensual overindulgence, which resulted in this, was taken up to the heavenward aspiring nous in Schubert's last months, and also, of course, during his whole life, but particularly in his last months. So we will end with a little excerpt from his song cycle. Hang on, Colin, Winterreise. You can stand here. Sorry. Yeah. Now the cycle Winterreise, set to poems by Bilimoria, is perhaps one of the most astounding compositions from this period, because it depicts, in a sense, the musical equivalent of a journey to the abyss of nothingness. The abyss of nothingness, the musical equivalent, I suppose, of Avicii. Now what is Avicii? Technically, it means the waveless state. Waveless means completely no energy, completely petrified, completely dead. And in the key, HPV says that when manas, the soul in general, or psyche, in Plato's terms, when it chooses to run headlong downwards towards anoia, it runs towards entire annihilation as far as the personal ego is concerned. And Winterreise depicts the 24 stages of this journey to the abyss of nothingness. A symbolic journey through bleak landscapes, a metaphor for numbed emotions, snowstorms and trees stripped of their leaves. It is really an intimate, personal confession of the composer and a reflection of his own state of mind when he had to bear the heavy burden of his immense loneliness, of his early disappointments in love, which he chose to deal with in the way that precipitated his fatal illness. And the first 5 songs form a sort of group. In the first song, Good Night, and I won't say it in German, we hear the tread of the wandering youth. A stranger I come, a stranger I go. In the spring, the girl spoke of love. Her mother even spoke of marriage. But now I have to leave the town where she lives with only the moon to shine over the snowfields. And then he writes good night on her snow-covered gate as the weathercock plays with the wind. And he finds surprisingly that the tears that fall from his cheek turn to ice. And in vain he searches for the footprints that she once left in the grass in happier times. Then he passes the linden tree, in whose shade he once dreamed such lovely dreams, but now he can't stand the sight of it. But this is no sentimental tale, I tell you, of an estranged lover. In all such powerful works of art, where there is a dangerous journey, where there is a jilted lover, the girl once left behind, the one-time happy memories under the shade of a tree, there is a universal symbology at work. Of course, these are all personalizations of divine principles. The girl you love, of course, is your spiritual soul. You can call it Atma Buddhi. The lonely wanderer is Manas, the human soul. The dangerous journey, of course, is the life. So the personalization is the exterior garb. The personalization is the exterior clothing of the universal. We would not recognize the universal were it not clothed in something that we could see, touch and hear with our senses. If the universal were not wrapped up in the personal, we would not sense it or touch it. So if we now hear the 5th song, thanks Colin, in this tremendous cycle, Come hither, young fellow, the linden tree calls mockingly to the youth as he continues his winter journey.